Scam graphics cards. They seem to be hailed as a modern phenomenon, but the reality is these cards go way back, and they are far worse and much sketchier than you could even begin to imagine. Now this here is a card that I bought off eBay as new old stock, and I probably paid just a bit too much for it, but it was from a company that I've never heard of, Phantom 3D, and there were no results online for this company, what brand this even was, or what graphic card they were actually selling. Virtually no information about it existed, so it seemed like it was up to us to figure out where it came from, which led me down a very ancient rabbit hole of scams, disappointment, and a whole world of graphics cards that have long since been lost to time. Fortunately though, as our card is new old stock, we got the same experience that you would have gotten 20 years ago, excited for your new gaming graphics card. And inside the box is another box, including one of the most disappointing looking graphics cards I've ever seen. It felt so light that I wouldn't be surprised if the heatsink is made out of some form of paper, and it does include a warranty registration card. Yep, you got one of those, so if you bought this absolute scam of a card, you did get a warranty included, and it seems like no one even decided to do that. A manual is printed on a very sad looking bit of white paper with some troubleshooting tips, but not actually too much else. And finally, you do get a rather nice looking driver CD, which is something I suppose, but then again, that really is the bare minimum here. So why don't we set up a little system real fast and just double check that after 20 years in a box, this rather sad looking thing actually powers on and gives us a display. Now that might look quite exciting, but that is actually a signal from the name of the card was 3D Phantom XP3800 AGP VGA card. So we're getting somewhere. Now we just need an operating system. Now this is the weird thing with this graphics card. Usually when it comes to scam cards, you can try and research them all you want, and there's very little information on their origin out there. So you go back over 20 years and you're trying to find out what is a 3D Phantom and why did they exist, and it proves rather difficult. So I've done the best I can, found where these retailed, found who bought them, and found out that a lot of people were very disappointed. But it took weeks of scrolling through old forum archives, all of the Wayback Machine, just trying to find an inch of information on these, because when you look at this box, nothing about it screams SIS. I've given it to a few people and said, what brand is this? And no one has figured it out, because the only mention of SIS is here, a little line on the back. All of it is largely just tech mumbo jumbo designed to make you think, wow, this is amazing, and half of it's lies anyway. So, this is what I've managed to find on the 3D Phantom graphics card. What is this one? The XP3800, and why this thing exists in the first place. Old traces of this card were found online through weeks and weeks of scrolling through forums and websites on the Wayback Machine, and it led me to very few references on this card, so from what I can figure out, it was released sometime in early 2003 and retailing till the end of 2006, 2007 in some places. Trying to decipher most of this information came from forum posts on the older parts of the website, where people were arguing about the legality of owning a katana next to questions about graphics cards, and it made it remarkably difficult to find people actually talking about the 3D Phantom. Some of the best resources, oddly enough, was one very confused person that went onto the Matrox forums because he used Matrox graphics cards at work, and was then convinced by a salesman in PC World, which is now Curry's, that this was a new graphics card from 3DFX and was vastly superior to the Radeon and Nvidia FX offerings.
There was also a PSA over on the Anantech forums of 2005, which consisted of a group of people having seen these on sale in Maplins, with the staff there eager to try and get rid of them. The general consensus was, though, that for people not too computer savvy or maybe outdated with their knowledge, they were being not sold these as SIS cards, but to some extent with the 3D branding, some confusing, sales plays led customers into believing these were 3DFX cards even, when in reality, you are getting more or less an old iGPU from a motherboard stuck onto an AGP card and sold to you as a brand new product. Their website wasn't much better, with Pine, the company that make this, offering a variety of these cards, but they did offer them as what apparently are SIS cards on their website, and they must have known what they were selling because, no word of a lie, they have a quote about suffering from Mao Zedong right there on the webpage. You are selling a graphics card, and your main quote you're going for is suffering. Interesting. The rest of the advertising nonsense is mostly about realistic 3D graphics, but more interestingly, this company had also started selling their Nvidia series, no longer under the Pine name, under something else and a name we will all recognise, XFX. Some very shady dealings going on here, and it's not just from those that sold the card, because at least they do list it as SIS cards, but still, very interesting how these ended up on the shelf as something a little bit different. Sadly, that was about all the information that did exist on these cards, but they did by all accounts have an AGP 8x flagship, and more depressingly, they offered one of these with a measly 8 megabytes of VRAM, which sold until about 2007, something that I will be keeping my eyes out for. Pricing wise, £50 for one of these is about on average what they seem to have sold for as retail in the UK, and that is an absolute rip-off, given that the Radeon 9200 launched at the same price, the FX 5200 from Nvidia that I am not a fan of, but is generally a despised card, sold for either the same price or less, and then by the time these things have been on the market for a year, at the same £50 retail price, Radeon had the 9250 for half the price of this card. So I can only assume that these were sold to target people that fell for the false 3D naming and all the tech mumbo jumbo on the box. It just took clever words from a salesman to get rid of them. And that is all I could find on the existence of this card. Specifications wise, this thing is absolutely dire. Based on the SIS315 chip, which was released in the late year 2000, this is actually an SIS315E chip, which is from a motherboard, where performance was questionable at best. The 3D Phantom 3800 Plus comes with 2 pixel pipelines, 2 text units, and is based on a 150nm process. Our card does come with a blistering 32 megabytes of VRAM, which is fortunately dual data rate RAM, and this card has support for DirectX 7, but this seems partial at best, so most games tend to utilize DirectX 6 to some capacity, or the alternative OpenGL 1.2, which apparently is meant to be 1.3, but I couldn't really get that to work all too well. Still, it does utilize an AGP 4x slot. Not that it'll do a whole lot of good, but perhaps it'll make it better than the original graphics chip they based this on, or stole it from, or salvaged it from. I don't know how these things got made. It costs, from what I found online, around £50 to £60 from its retail span between 2004 to 2006, with them quickly disappearing on from there. Little seems to be known about them. I'm assuming very few sales actually came through their website, and with the amount of these that do show up as new old stock, I'd imagine there's a good chunk of retailers that bought a ton of them in, and then as soon as they couldn't get rid of them anymore, they ended up in a warehouse until eventually, here in 2024, they are now re-entering the market. It's absolute insanity. They did have cheaper models on the market, and slightly better ones as well, but those do seem to be rarer. In fact, you know, these cards are just rare now. It's weird. You will find them, and if you do, they'll be brand new in box, but there's nothing redeeming this card here. You know, these are spare SIS chipsets that were too old to sell, given some fancy branding, a basic cooler, and then trying to sell them as a competitor to ATI, Nvidia, and Matrox for the same money that their cards were going for. And funnily enough, it must have worked, because the company that made these, well, they're still in business. As you may have noticed in the background though, we have been installing Windows XP onto the Compact Test System, which is the latest operating system that this card is actually advertised for. All that came next was needing some drivers so we could truly utilise the card. Fortunately, our card actually came with drivers, so why don't we just use those? Well, they don't work. Maybe it could be data rot or something. I mean, it's been sat in a box for 20 years. All the files show up on the DVD. You just can't do anything with them. They have some form of copy protection on it, as I couldn't even make a backup to an ISO, just an original full-size backup of the original disc. And when attempting to load them on Windows XP, an older version of Windows, and even new versions of Windows, they all did the same thing, and just said demo.exe has stopped responding. Attempting to copy files and just read them directly wouldn't work and would stop the disk from reading. We tried multiple DVD drives and had no progress. So I'm assuming that this might have been something common, given that the one forum post I was able to find on drivers talked about them not working. Interesting, that. Fortunately, being based on an SAS315E, it means there are drivers available for this chipset, and there technically should be drivers for even Windows 7 upwards if you fancy going down that route. Realistically though, it looks like these drivers are the exact same ones that included on our DVD, so after installing those and making our way through the remarkably bare bones installer, we saw that the card does actually have some features. But they are exceptionally basic by the standards of 2004, when Matrox was offering you super sampling control, 3D Phantom offers you gamma control. Really, that is about all you get here. There was very little it can actually do. It has an AGP test feature, which lets you confirm it's running at AGP 4x speed, which is nice. I mean, it doesn't do anything, but it's nice. And so far from what we've done, well, it looks okay from a VGA output, but then again it should do. The main issue we ran into is occasionally I'd have to give the card a wiggle after I restarted the PC because it wanted to use its onboard graphics rather than this. And I don't blame the computer for wanting to do that, but it just meant wiggle it about and then it'd start working again. I don't know, it's not the PC, it's the graphics card. These things are terrible, it's a scam. I've been working on this for too long. So finally, the part we've all been waiting for. We've done some testing with the compact PC that I grabbed from the boot fair a little while ago, running Windows XP Service Pack 3. We've got an AMD Athlon 64 processor, 1GB of DDR RAM clocking in at 400MHz, and really, this thing is completely overkill for testing a lot of these older AGP cards, especially these ones that no one has heard of. But that's why I decided to keep it around. All the footage you're about to see is being captured directly from the 3D Phantom graphics card. So painfully, you will now be exposed to everything that I bore witness to in the benchmarks. Starting things off nice and easy with Half-Life 1 running in DirectX mode, with a nice enough 1024x768 resolution. Keep in mind, most cards from this era that this scam card came out in would run the game in 1600x1200 or even higher. Even those cards came in at a relatively similar cost. But it was playable enough with 42 FPS on average throughout the opening sequence, and OpenGL performed very similar, so it didn't matter what API you were using here, you were going to see this sort of performance regardless. So playable, but not a great start given that this game came out over half a decade before they started selling this card. The Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind was not a great experience at all. Even with the lowest settings in a tiny 640x480 resolution, we saw some of the worst performance I have ever seen from a graphics card that can actually launch this game, with the game sometimes being playable at around 20 FPS, but then you'd frequently run into issues and the game would hitch up for no apparent reason. This could be caused by dialogue. That's right, text appearing on screen could bring you down to around 1 FPS, and then you just have to wait to exit out of it and go back into it, and sometimes just walking too quickly. That could give you awful frame times, and you would see those appalling 1% low figures. Overall, I'm actually sort of impressed to see Morrowind load on a card that runs it this badly. Usually if your card launches Morrowind, you can play the game as long as you're willing to go low enough down on settings. But this may be the worst performance I've ever seen from a card that can actually launch the game. But this was the big one. The year is 2004, and you were buying a graphics card, so you were likely buying it for one thing: Half-Life 2. And to all those people that ran out to Maplins and PC World and wherever they actually found a 3D Phantom graphics card, well, I understand your pain now. Half-Life 2 ran actually okay in terms of frame rate at around 26 FPS. Trust me, that is good for this card. Despite the card saying it supports hardware transformer lighting and DirectX 7 features, well, the lies can be seen here. With the game barely operating in DirectX 6 mode, most models would show up with what looks to be their normal map being rendered, leading to some funky looking fellas running about the map, and it did make the system blue screen for no reason once or twice. But for all intents and purposes, even in action, it was playable. But just imagine, you went out and you spent £50 to upgrade your PC to play Half-Life 2. And this is the only way you were able to do it. Because you didn't buy a Radeon card, you didn't want an Nvidia card, you weren't going Matrox. No, you were going 3D Phantom. And I can see why people regretted it. Older titles like DICE's first 3D game, you know, the same people that make Battlefield, well, they started with Volvo S40 Racing, which ran pretty good in a 1024x768 resolution. It was a pain to capture this though, as the card had a weird bug where it would default to 34.6 Hz for no apparent reason and disappear entirely from the display. No clue why it did this, as soon as you actually got in game and started utilizing the renderer, well, it would go back to 60 Hz, so bit of a strange problem there for the 3D Phantom, but still, when you got in game, you know, it ran alright with decent 3D image output, and I can't help but think that, you know, the performance for a 2000s card, not bad. The performance for a 2004 card, awful, given that one of our best performing titles so far is a game that you got for free if you bought a Volvo in 1997. Command & Conquer and Generals ran like crap. I'm sorry, that's the only real way to say it. The opening cutscene struggled to manage any more than 8 FPS and was so slow, the game ran internally at a third of its normal speed, nearly breaking cutscene events. I have never seen something do so poorly here that it would nearly break the game. The game would simply chug along, rendering one explosion at a time because it physically couldn't bloody manage to run more than one at a time, and hate to say it, but it's completely unplayable. For something that could run on an Intel Extreme Graphics 2, not a great showing for something that you were meant to put in your PC to replace that exact type of iGPU. Not great. Unreal Tournament 2003 ran with lower settings in 640x480 and was just about playable. I wouldn't call it good or competitive, as whenever there was someone on screen, your frame rate would halve. So in some ways, it's sort of a built-in player detection. Maybe it's hacks, who knows? Maybe you could use it to your advantage. You know, if you can manage the near enough slideshow it becomes when there are multiple people on screen at the same time. Still, there were no graphical issues or weird problems, which was nice to see after everything else so far, and it was by all accounts a slightly modern game from when the card came out, running okay So it's a win. A very small one, and a slightly terrible one, but this is a win for the 3D Phantom. Classic titles, on the other hand, weren't actually too bad either, with Unreal Gold usually managing to hit our 60 FPS target with high settings enabled in a 640x480 resolution, as the card did struggle with particle effects and much more with transparency, which would half the frame rate. Still, it looks okay, ran okay, and just another instance of the card being good enough for titles near on half a decade before it actually hit the shelves. Mount & Blade Warband would at first refuse to work, and I was about to give up on it because it would just crash whenever the game opened, until I clicked launch without realising I still had Half-Life 1 open, which for some reason must have jogged DirectX 7 into working just enough for the game to not crash. If you closed Half-Life 1, the game would crash, so it sort of has to run in parity. It also wouldn't work with the capture card, only on the CRT, and it looked appalling, with settings so low they shouldn't be seen by the human eye. Combined with this, it also ran terribly, with single-digit frame rates being the norm, and it was smooth enough thanks to the input latency of the CRT, as sometimes it could go up to sort of the mid-teens in terms of FPS, but, you know, absolutely terrible performance and graphics for something that usually runs on absolutely everything. I did test Roller Coaster Tycoon 2 just to get an idea on how it performs in 2D tasks, and honestly, not too bad. The analog output quality is relatively sharp with no glaring issues from the 640x480 up to 1600x1200, so there's no problems here when it comes to 2D displays. But then again, we really are at the bottom of the barrel for a card released in the near mid-2000s, and we are discussing VGA output quality, which mattered a lot more back in sort of the mid-90s to the late 90s, as let's be honest, Matrix cards had that covered and seemed to perform a blind sight better than this did. So I'm a bit of a loss for words here that I'm praising it for something that is literally, can it display something on screen? It can do it, and it doesn't look too bad. Quake 3 ran okay, but even then, the game had some glaring performance issues, with 56 FPS on average being hammered down to half of that when things got heavy, or mostly when reflections were being shown on screen, with it being an instant transition down to 24 FPS, which is all the eye can see, so absolutely fine. The built-in benchmark showed that the game was playable, but in reality, there was this heavy delay in some maps and scenes when the card was rendering more than it was capable of. Usually, this is a go-to title that will run on anything. And I won't say it was unplayable, because it definitely wasn't, but it's interesting just how much this card is hammered by things just running. You know, the benchmarks run okay, but then you actually go to play the game, and you realise those benchmarks, well, this card is almost like it's optimised to show that it's good in them, and nothing more. But finally, can it run Crysis? Well, of course not. The card clearly can't even support DirectX 7 properly, and we need DirectX 9. But there were some funky issues on the installer which didn't clear up all throughout the entire time the window was open, and the game detects it as running on an SIS 315 based graphics card before crashing. So that's as far as you get. No Crysis, but the Crysis dialog box mentions the graphics card. Now that's interesting. Overall performance is questionable, especially with the card being launched at a rather high price tag in the mid-2000s, and for something that has advertising whacked all over it about gaming performance, well, in those 90s titles maybe you could call this something resembling alright performance, but compared to even lackluster Nvidia options like the FX 5200, well, the performance is dire. There are strange instability issues in most games from its release, and Half-Life 2, well, that was just downright strange. It's difficult to sum up the performance because, in the context of today buying one as a retro card, well, for 90s titles it is okay, but there's still better options out there. In the context of the year it was released in, this is atrocious. This is like buying a graphics card today for say £80, which should by all accounts run most titles out there today in at least low settings, and then you're finding it's struggling to run the original release of Skyrim. I did discover another feature of the card though. It's meant to come with an on-screen display feature, but sadly that would crash every time we used it, every time we opened it, anytime we tried to do anything with it, sometimes knocking out the game we were trying to load it in with it. I'm not too sure what the on-screen display offers, but when you can't actually open the feature, it's hard to know whether it contained anything redeeming at all. Maybe this is how you enable full-screen anti-aliasing that this card apparently supports, because the drivers don't have options for it, and it didn't matter if we launched a game with OpenGL or DirectX, it would crash right after we started the process. Finally, the card did offer the stunning feature of DVD playback. And usually for most cards, well, you take that at face value, especially in this era. If it's advertising DVD playback, it can probably do it. But when the card seems to have done so poorly at everything else, the question is, does it even perform such a basic task? So after loading up Windows Media Player with all the codecs needed for DVD playback, just giving it software it should by all accounts manage to use, it couldn't do it at all, with constant hitching and dropping frames that made it look like the scene was rubber banding as the card struggled to decode anything. This wasn't much better with MP4 videos when loaded onto the PC, with them loading in a shade of green, regardless of which media player you were using. I did notice something similar to this when launching Generals, with the video playback noticeably dropping frames before the game had even started. It's also worth noting that using this very scientific method of just prodding the heatsink while the card was running was the best way to indicate whether it was actually doing something, and this was the hottest the card got when doing basic video playback. Now I know this card claims support for Windows XP, but just to confirm that it wasn't having issues with the operating system, I tested it with a Windows 9X OS, Windows 98, and it was exactly the same, with the same drivers and all those types of problems. The on-screen display refused to work, and the performance was more or less the exact bloody same. So it doesn't matter what kind of environment you give this card, it fails to redeem itself every time, in every possible way. So there we have it, probably the original scam graphics card, and all I can say is I really want to track down the other two 3D Phantom cards. They did a high-end AGP 8x card, which I really want to get my hands on, and I can only assume, was the flagship that everyone wanted. Why would you want a Radeon 9700? Why would you want a Matrox Parhelia? Why would you want any of that when 3D Phantom had a flagship? They also had another card that is, all I can assume, going to be the most appallingly slow thing to exist, with 8 megabytes of VRAM in the early to mid 2000s. And if people do want to see these on the channel, please do let me know. This video has been a while in the making, as trying to source any information on this card took hours to achieve. That and the benchmarking was so slow that even that took a while. I hope you've all enjoyed watching this video. Thank you very much for watching, and good night. I don't think he's a real policeman.